welcome to Fast Keto. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm thrilled to have you and to talk all about high-fat carnivore today. How's it going?
It's good, Vanessa. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm honored to be here with you and speak about all things carnivore and especially the high-fat side.
Maybe tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up working with MeatRx and just in this carnivore space.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I ended up and I've kind of had weight issues for a while. I ended up doing, various approaches throughout the years for like the last actually almost 20 years from the time I ended up and had my first kid. I ended up and, was first time mom. I did the I'm going to eat for two mentality. So, I gained the weight. I never really lost that weight. And then after that, I had two more children. And so, that kind of took the toll of I never lost all the weight. And then I got pregnant again and I gained even more weight. And then, so that was just kind of a vicious cycle. I did the whole calorie in, calorie out, eat less, move more. Throughout the years, like I said, this has been, 20 years and I did various approaches. So I was definitely a yo-yoer. I would end up and do like Weight Watchers. I lost and then I ended up in, I never really focused on the mindset or the health and the healing. I just focused on weight as, the primary goal. And I wanted to get it off, kind of the whole mentality of I want to get it off as quick as I can. And so then, that kind of after my last child, I ended up having a hysterectomy. So, fast forward to basically within the last, 10, 12 years, she'll be 12 next week. And then 2 years after that, I had a complete hysterectomy. So that threw in a whole nother ball of wax of complete hysterectomy, put into surgical menopause, not having the hormones. I didn't do any hormone therapy, and things just kind of started to progressively get worse, over time. I have a huge family history of various things from high blood pressure to my dad being type 2 diabetic, cancers in my family. And I started to see my health kind of decline. Like I said, I had the hysterectomy, and then I was also starting to have like some heart issues. I was seeing a cardiologist, which also led to a pulmonologist because I was getting like asthma. They were trying to, kind of go hand in hand. I did, every year we did some lab work and I started to notice my A1C started to climb. And it got to the point of basically being pre-diabetic. It was like 5.8, 6.0. And so, when it's in black and white, it kind of smacks you in the face and says, you're on 7 different medications for all these things. You're getting worse. You've got to do something. You go to the doctor. Of course, I got put on inhalers. I got put on, thyroid medicine. I got put on statin because of my cardiac issues. And I knew at that point I had to do something for myself to take my health into my own hands. And so I started doing a ketogenic lifestyle. I did that, really clean for maybe the first year. Didn't use, any of the keto products that are out now. I just ended up and did, keep your carbs under 20 grams, end up, eating the low glycemic fruit, vegetables, protein, moderate protein, high fat. Now, I did end up over time start transitioning that more to like fat bombs and, all those keto type things. Well, then I hit a stall with keto. And I listened to a lot of influencers at the time that ended up and were doing fasting. Redmond's come out with their fasting, and had influencers through there. And so I started that. I did 72 and I did, up to 96-hour fast. And that created a vicious cycle because I would end up and kind of splurge on a time when, I was eating, but then I was like, oh, well, I can do, 72-hour fast. And so I finally quit fasting. And I was only consuming like a handful of vegetables towards about, it would have been like 2018. In October, November-ish, I found Sean. And, I'm from Nebraska, so I'm a Midwest beef country girl. And here's this guy that is, nothing but eating ribeyes, because at the time he was eating like 2 ribeyes a day. And I'm like, I can do this, I can eat beef. We stock our freezer every year with a whole beef. And so I kind of started to look into that, still kept, a little bit of keto through like Thanksgiving and Christmas. But I was more like ketovore-ish.
Yeah.
Some of my meals would be pure carnivore, but yet, like I said, I still ended up and had a few things over the holidays. And finally, Sean geared up for World Carnivore Month in January, just as we always do. And I'm like, it's 30 days. I can do anything for 30 days. And so I jumped in, and that was, it'll be 2 years ago. And I haven't looked back. I lost the cravings. Like when I was doing keto, I would end up and just those small amount of carbs would still create a craving,
Yeah.
and it just, it kept that cycle. And now with being full carnivore, within the first year, I ended up getting off all my medications. My A1C is down to normal range. And so, and I'm not dealing with any of the side effects of having my hysterectomy anymore either. So it's been great over the last 2 years. And there's been some tweaking throughout the years, or throughout the 2 years of carnivore, but I'm sure we'll get into that. So.
Yeah, I love that you are an experimenter, and that you like to try different things. I always encourage people to try different things because you can only observe what other people are doing for so long. The only way to figure out the best thing for you is to just try different things, right? And see what you feel best on and what works for you. And, physiologically, humans, we have a lot in common, but there's still like variety and a lot of differences in terms of like the way we've been restricting in the past or eating and all kinds of stuff. So I love that you try different things and you're constantly, I see you're still testing new things and trying them out. So I think some of the experimenting too, you've been doing a little bit with Sean to try to test different things on with your CGM, continuous blood glucose monitor and stuff. So what have you been experimenting with and finding through that?
So the first one I did was early on in my carnivore journey. I ended up and used it because just like anyone that comes to carnivore, I thought, I can eat basically all the meat I want as long as I keep it on the fatty side. So I did, I did like Sean. I did the ribeyes, I did the chuck eyes, I did, brisket, pork butt, all the fattier cuts of meat. But, as I said, I had a high A1C. So I've been one that does, not only my food tracking, but I also track, the glucose. And so I ended up with the first CGM, and I noticed my readings were a little bit high. Like they would be 120 to 140, peak at like 188. And that's not normal, let me backtrack. That can be normal for a type 2, type 1 diabetic to have those readings. But for me, that was not normal. I should, be anywhere between like 80 and 90 typically when I was checking before. And so I knew something was off. And that's where I really started with that CGM and pulling the protein back to more of my keto macros of the moderate protein, but the higher fat. Now, when I did that, I kept the dairy in there. And so I was utilizing a lot of like heavy whipping cream and butter and sour cream, cream cheese, those type of fats with that first one. And so I didn't jump in strictly with animal fats like I am now. But I also noticed, so that was like during the first year of carnivore. And then, well, it was within like the first few months of carnivore. And so I really focused on the healing that first year. I wanted all of my symptoms gone. And I have been, cleared from the physicians. And so that was my primary goal. I didn't care about the weight loss, weight gain. I just wanted the healing, and I wanted off of the medications. And so then, like I said, I brought that down. I end up and I use a company called Keto Mojo for my finger prick stickings, because I just did both of the CGMs I did were just the 14-day trials. So, I had the monitor for 14 days. I figured out what works for me for protein. Doesn't, like you said, doesn't mean it's going to work for you or work for any of your listeners. It's what worked for me. It's what stabilized my glucose. And so I kind of rode that wave of being in that window of, this is, kind of my good spot for protein. And then with this last one that I did with Sean, we looked at the difference in the fats. So this year has been more of a transition more to the animal-based fats. I gave up dairy in January, like I said, for World Carnivore Month. I gave it up, and now I still allow it in moderation, but it's not my primary fat focus. So I've transitioned from dairy over to animal fats, which there's many types of animal fats that are good, for various things, but predominantly I focus on suet. And when we did this last experiment in the end of the month, beginning of October, we found, so I did eat in a surplus, which it's, there again, calories in, calories out. I was in a surplus, but I never had weight gain from it. I never had, any really negative effect from eating a surplus. But we found that in regards to the glucose, the beef really, my body really responded well to it. It actually drove my glucose down, my ketones up, which is natural. If you're eating a higher fat, you're typically going to have a higher ketone. Pork did raise the glucose a little bit. Pork fat did. But dairy really ended up and had the glycemic impact on me. So, like I said, I still incorporate it occasionally, but nothing that I rely predominantly on for my fat source.
I wonder if it's some of the lactose somehow gets in there and affects things, or what that is. It's interesting. Like, what are the main, I guess I was going to ask you, what are some of the main differences, or have you noticed any other changes other than the blood sugar from doing more animal fats versus, cutting the dairy out?
So one of the things that I ended up and noticed kind of right away was the residual inflammation and bloating within me when I pulled that dairy out. When I pulled it out for the 30 days in January, my rings used to be really tight on my fingers. Like I was inflamed, not only my fingers, but my joints. And I also had a little bit of belly bloat still going on. And when I pulled that dairy out, it was amazing to see how that changed, along with, I had some rosacea kind of going on. Not horrible, but, still there to the point of having to cover it up with makeup. And that started to get better. So my skin even started to, change and get clear just by pulling that dairy out. So I do think for some it is problematic. It can also, for other people, cause a weight stall.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you see that all the time. And, I always believed that dairy caused inflammation in people. And a lot of that was from my vegan and vegetarian brainwashing. I really held on to that for so long. And then I've seen even just recent research showing that they tested all these children for any cytokines or inflammatory markers with dairy, and they didn't have any, although the test was in children. Maybe it's different with adults, but that's really, really interesting. And I guess it's one of those things you can only, assess for yourself by trying it out. It kind of makes me want to try it out and see what happens. But that's really interesting. And you eat a lot of animal fat. I mean, if you look, you have a great Instagram, you post all your meals, and we were talking a little bit before about how when you eat high fat carnivore, it doesn't look like anyone else's plate. So I think it's challenging for people. Like, I've been in the keto space for about 6 years and eating this way, and I still find it challenging to make my carnivore plates, super ketogenic. Like, I still do more of a modified approach because it's just easier to just eat higher protein, or even like, I don't mean high protein, but higher than moderated protein. But you really have to push yourself to like outside of your comfort zone to eat this way, because it's so unique and different from anything that like I know I've ever seen in anyone do or anything in life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of my coaching clients end up and come to me and they're like, well, I've been eating high fat because, I'll take a steak and I'll add a couple tablespoons of butter or, tallow to it or whatever. And I'm like, yes, that is, adding those extra fats, and that's great. But getting to the point, and I always end up and tell people, remind you, I am, 2 years into this. So people that get in there and really get the animal fats, pull that protein back, I don't expect anyone, I reference a seesaw a lot. So as you pull, your protein down, slowly bring that fat up. I think the body helps to transition a little bit better by doing that. And it's not quite a shock to you, because a lot of people are so, for so many years, fat's got a bad rap. And so when you tell someone to start adding fat, now granted, like you referenced, it may not work for everyone. I'm not dogmatic in thinking that high fat is the only way to go. I think fat is very beneficial, but for some people it doesn't work, and they're able to do more of the protein focus. They'll add a fat here and there. But to get to, where I am with my pictures on my Instagram of just sitting down with a bowl of fat, and then my second meal, I'll add the fat and have a little bit of protein. And then my last meal is typically just a fatty protein. If it's a leaner protein, I do add fat to that meal. But I'm typically at a minimum, 80% of mine is fat to protein. So it's at a minimum 80-20, sometimes a little bit higher, 90-10, sometimes even higher than that. Like you said, I like to experiment. So, I kind of have a baseline of where I hit, but then I kind of tweak and adjust overall. But, it is hard for some, like you said, when you sit down, and one thing to kind of help the mind aspect of it is to eat it off a smaller plate. We've always focused on a bigger, like dinner size plate, but bring that plate down, to a smaller size plate. And that also helps. Like, I don't use a big, soup bowl. My bowl in the morning is kind of a smaller bowl, but yet it's still, it's full. So, and I also don't eat my suet raw. I think it kind of is waxy raw. So I always cook mine, but.
So how did you first learn how to source and find, all these animal-based fats? I don't really know of any groups out there who do ketogenic carnivore, except for Paleo with their PKD approach. That's the only maybe community that I know of that practices a ketogenic carnivore. So at the beginning, how did you did you just figure it out on your own, or did you join some groups, or did you follow some people just to learn how to do this on your own?
Well, so like I referenced, we always end up and get a beef processed every year. We get the fat from it. We also get a hog processed.
Oh.
Usually we end up and get, FFA kids end up and have the animals that they show, or the 4-H kids. And so we would always end up and get, at least a pig and a beef every year. and we would always get the fat from it. Well, the butchers would end up and ask me, especially with the pig, do you want us to render it? And then we'd get these, chunks of lard. And one year we were saving money, so we didn't have any of it smoked. We didn't have, we tried processing it as little as possible and doing it ourselves. So we have a smoker, we have, we can do that with our hams and everything. And so the fat, we ended up not having rendered into lard. I said, just leave it, and started chunking that up. Now I do have to give, credit to my friend Sarah, because she did, she got hers through US Wellness and White Oak Pastures. And so then I found the online sources, because as you're consuming it, you do go through a lot. And as I've recommended to people, and they're starting to see, the fat not be readily available. So I do end up and use local sources for mine. All of the meat that we consume is raised within like a 25-mile radius of my house. The beef, the pigs, and now I get a lamb processed every year too. So it's all really local. And then I have a great butcher that I get a lot of my suet from. If, within the animals, because I am a higher fat, I go through it pretty rapidly. And so I do have a great butcher that he'll have customers come in and they're like, we don't want it, and he'll save it. I just, one of our Meter X meetings, I actually took them on the trip with me to go pick it up, and then, show them how I got it and how I end up and, bag it up, because he just puts it in a great big bag. He doesn't do any of the chopping or any of the cutting with it. And I was actually pretty blessed because some of it still had the organs in it. So like I said, I took our Meter X members that were on that meeting with us and showed them, how I do it. So, and I do have videos on how, when I get the chunk form of suet, how I break it down, how I, put it in baggies. So I go from chunk to plate with them on my YouTube.
Yeah, on your YouTube channel. That's great. Yeah, I know you share some helpful videos for people on there. Now, when you did your just like almost, I guess you went up, maybe, did you go up to 3,000 or 4,000 calories and you were eating in excess with the fat? What was that like? Was it hard to eat that much fat? How did you feel? And why do you think you didn't put any weight on?
So we did end up and push me up to that caloric surplus, because we also wanted to see, how would the glucose readings respond to eating in a surplus? Will just the caloric surplus bump the numbers? How will it respond with the fat? And so by doing that, we ended up, and I didn't, like I said, with the number wise, some were better than others. And I honestly don't think I ended up putting on the weight because my body was so efficient at burning that extra fat, being fat adapted, and it really responded with the keto numbers. I got in that higher level of ketosis, like you referenced, the PKD approach, using that therapeutic range. And so I think my body just ended up and utilized the energy. I got more energy, more mood stability, the clarity was really there. I've always been one that has to use, sticky notes or something like that to end up and remember. And it's just amazing how much, our brains function, which they're like 68% cholesterol anyway, but how our, mood and brain and all of that functions on the higher fat. And like I said, I didn't gain weight. And I think that was part of the process. Was it also increased by doing a surplus and not creating a deficit? It created that metabolic effect of speeding up the metabolism a little bit and just using it more efficiently.
Yeah, I truly believe the brain prefers ketones, and it's a little bit higher in calories for the brain, but I think that it just uses glucose because that's what's available. And if it
Mhm.
does have all these ketones available, it's going to preferentially use them. I know we're still learning about that, but I really do believe that. And I've talked to some lipid scientists who've had, similar beliefs just in studying things and just purely from opinion. But it does seem like the brain really loves having those ketones. So it's really cool to see. I have to try that out and do. How high in calories did you go and for how long?
So typically I was right around 3,000 calories. Some days a little bit more. Some days it went up, like 3,100, but I was kind of right in there for the 2 weeks that we ended up and did the NutriSense monitor. But I can end up and pull it up. I still am eating pretty much in, at least 2,700, if not more, calories now, and not seeing, any negative effects, even sitting that high. And I think that's where people really get concerned. They try to create a deficit. They try to end up and pull those calories back because for so many years, that's what we've been focused on is calories. And you'll hear a lot of people say, well, 1,200 calories or 1,500 calories. And honestly, for some people, that is just too low and it slows down that metabolism. So they kind of have to do, a refeed and really get in that surplus. And now, let me also pause and say, eating too high of calories can end up and be problematic. You can end up and overeat, but with me and that higher fat, that satiety factor does kick in. I do get to a point where I am satiated within that meal and I'm good for, 3-4 hours until, I eat again. Or some days it may even be a little bit longer depending how, my day goes with coaching sessions or meetings or work, it may be a little bit longer. And I think that's the difference also in eating a higher fat and having that fat for fuel versus being glucose and carb dependent, because they're always, it kicks in, you burn through it faster and then you're hungry, instead of the body being full and able to run more efficiently.
So when you stopped doing all the fasting, did you have weight gain then? Did you have kind of a period of adjusting to quitting all fasting and just going on this higher fat carnivore approach? Did you have to change things up, or just did you gain any? Did you have to make some changes, adjustments, and then lose a little after? How did that all go?
I did end up and gain a bit. Like I said, I was eating a lot of protein. Like I was packing away like 2 pounds of protein a day.
Yeah.
And that was the vicious cycle with the fasting, and being keto was I would fast, I would lose, but when it come time to refeed, I was doing it properly. I would end up and do, especially after my 96 hour, I started with broth, started with soft food, did it properly to break it, but I always felt depleted. I always felt like I couldn't get, replenished, nourished. I just felt like I was seeking something. And so that is one of the ways I knew, and I eat organs, and I was, breaking it also by consuming liver. I have, a bacon liver pate that I really love. But I just still felt lacking, and I would have, issues with my sleep. I'd have a lot of issues. Like I said, I'm the data tracker. So I have an Oura Ring, I have a Fitbit, I track a lot of things, not just my food. And there was a lot of issues within there. And so then that's, like I said, when I went high protein, high fat, I did end up and gain a bit. It was pretty minimal. It was only like maybe 5-10 pounds. So not a lot, but then when I did that CGM and I pulled the protein back, I have since within the last 2 years lost over 50 of the pounds that,
Wow.
but one of the things, I focus on a lot with my coaching clients is also take your pictures, take your measurements, because as we've kind of progressed, we will end up and put on lean body mass, or, by eating a more nourishing, the bone density can change. There's so much that can change. Now, yes, a pound is a pound. So if you have a pound of fat and a pound of muscle, the space they take up is different. And that's why I focus on the pictures at least once a month, is because that body comp will change. They may not see it reflected on a scale. I like to say that little box on the floor likes to lie to us, because, people will also self-sabotage. They'll be like, I didn't lose anything, I gained, but yet they may change, a pant size or get an extra hole in their belt, and so you need to focus on those aspects as well. But like I said, adjusting to what worked for me in my ratios is what ended up and helping me long term.
So for you to lose the 50 pounds, you didn't do any deficit at all?
No, I have focused on the higher fat. Now, I haven't always been at the 3,000 calories. I have ended up, anywhere between about 2,000, 2,500. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, for some, it sounds like a lot, but for others that are working out or doing, any type of high activity. So Monday through Friday for 12 hours a day, I have daycare kids, and I run, I play with them, I lug them up and downstairs, love them to death. But a lot of times we sit and we play, or we color, or, we're reading books, doing those type of things. So activity wise, I did end up and start to do, early on, I still had the mentality of I've got to work out. So I would actually get up at 4:30 in the morning in order to get my workout in before daycare kids hit my house. And in my opinion, it was honestly more stress to the body. It created more of that stress because I was lacking sleep, which is where we get our recovery and repair, and then try to pull 12-hour day of daycare, and then, continue working in the evening. And so I really focus more on walking, that type of movement versus a gym type workout. I do have resistance bands, I'll throw them in occasionally for, the weight resistant type thing. But as far as structured workout, I think people can overdo it, and it can honestly, not saying that people shouldn't move and shouldn't work out, but I think they can add within their healing time, it can add an additional stress to them, and the body doesn't know what to repair, so for me, my activity day, the 2,000 to 2,500, typically according to my Oura ring, I'm typically anywhere between 1,800, 1,900 on a total, burn calorie. So if you go by those two, I was in a surplus.
Yeah.
But, I wasn't, like I said, wasn't doing a lot of activity and exercise in addition to compensate either. I just focused a lot on the healing, and as the healing comes and as we end up and do that, I always say the extra weight is kind of our cushion. It's like our barrier, our body wants to protect us. And so it holds on to this, especially if you're someone that does calorie deficit. It doesn't want to let go of it because it doesn't know, is it going to get the calories it needs for, the day? And so it hangs on to it just in case. But as you heal, as you fix your metabolism, it will end up and release that to where your body, is supposed to be. Now, I'm not obviously single digits by any means. I'm not going to go out and, be a bikini model fitness person on stage by any means, but I am at a healthy, maintainable range. And that's why I do the experimenting I do now, is because I have healed and I am, at a healthy weight for my height.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I've observed a lot of people in carnivore who've had weight loss, and I've seen this pattern emerge where they'll start carnivore and they'll eat all in like 3, 4, 5, sometimes more than that, 1,000 calories a day. And then around 6 months in, they have this appetite correction, and then they end up eating half as much. And so they gain weight for like 6 months, and then they end up losing it. And to me, that speaks to the calorie model of energy that, you know, they're boosting their metabolic rate up so high and then gaining for a while. But obviously there's also other things happening in there. There's healing, insulin's coming down, there's all kinds of other things that are happening. But I just find it interesting, maybe in those cases they're doing higher protein, and then so doing the, if they're doing like the standard eat 3-4 pounds of meat a day, eat until you can't eat another bite kind of approach, that they end up losing weight after because they lower their calories. And it just makes sense logically. But I do love hearing about the situations like yours, where even like there's case studies where people do reverse diets, which are similar, and they stop restricting calories from 1,000, 1,200, go up to 3,000, and they end up losing weight on the way. So there's obviously more going on than just the numbers, but we don't know what those things are. So I find when people, what do you say to people when they come to you and they're trying carnivore and they're frustrated and they're not getting results? I'm assuming you tell them to focus on health and just be patient, but there must be situations where they're just stuck. And like, what do you suggest to them in those situations?
And my biggest thing is trust the process. You know, I say that a lot. A lot of people end up, you know, whether it's been in the meetings or coaching sessions, is to trust the process. And it is hard. And I get that. It can be frustrating. And that's where the great community that we have, you know, with MeetRx is we're able to end up and get in there. We're able to focus on struggles. We're able to, you know, troubleshoot it. But also the fact that you've got to end up and heal. You've got to, you know, provide your body that time. But there again, you know, if you're high protein and it stops working, you can create a lot of issues by creating a deficit. And that's where people tend to go is, like you said, they're eating all this meat. Well, then they end up and pull it back, and then they end up and have more issues. Or even on high fat, I've seen it too, where people will pull the caloric value back thinking they've hit a stall. And so then they end up and create issues, you know, for themselves. And whether it's, you know, adrenals, thyroid, you know, metabolism. So it is hard, like I said, to trust the process. But, you know, if your high protein isn't working, try switching it up. Try going to the high fat. You know, Sean come out with his Get Shredded guide, you know, where it focuses on more of like the leaner proteins and then doing a fat refeed day, or, you know, a couple days a week, or, you know, those type of things. So as far as me with a higher fat now, like I said, I've had, you know, I do keep my electrolytes in balance. I think those are really important as well. So I do electrolytes and I do the high fat, but I also don't hit the same macros on a daily basis. And I think that is also very important. You know, that was one of the things that throughout the 2.5 years, 3 years that I did keto, you get your macros and you hit them on a daily basis. Your body gets used to that. And so then it causes a stall, or it causes, you know, the stagnant area. And you just, so with me, I have a window, you know, I have a protein window, and then I use fat as my lever, basically, if that's how you want to reference it. Some days I may be 200 grams of fat. Some days I may be 300, you know, if I need the energy, if I need, you know, if I know I'm going to have a long day, or maybe I didn't sleep very well, you know, the night before for whatever reason. I have teenage kids. I have 2 college kids, you know, maybe I didn't have a real great night's sleep. And so that next day, I will end up and actually have more fat. I lean on the fat. And I think that helps too, not hitting the same thing, but creating so the body is constantly guessing. Because, if I'm eating, say, 250, 300 grams of fat, I pull it back to 200 grams of fat and I'm fat adapted, where's the body going to end up and get its extra, 50 grams of fat that it may want? It's going to tap into my body. And so, by creating that, but yet having, a pretty small window on my protein creates the glucose stability. Not saying that gluconeogenesis isn't a thing and it's not a bad thing. I think it does get kind of a bad rap from a lot of people, but also the fact of the overprotein and your body not being able to burn through all of the protein, I think, can also have its impacts as well. But like I said, using the fat, having that extra energy is also very beneficial in creating that range, if that's what I want to call it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I love that you're a coach and you personally help people with this. So where can people find you if they want to give you a call and do some coaching with you, or maybe just check out your YouTube or your Instagram to get some ideas on how to do a high-fat carnivore diet?
I am on YouTube as my name, Becky Niles. You can find me on Instagram as Becky Niles Carnivore and EO. And then I am also on MeatRx, and you can end up and find my coaching page there with my availability for coaching. So
awesome. And just a last question. I know that at MeatRx, you guys have started incorporating the fasting. So what's your opinion on fasting, having experienced it yourself and then kind of transitioned out of it?
fasting can be a great tool for someone, especially if they are fat adapted. A lot of people will do intermittent fasting. Like I said, the fine line of it being a great tool and it being a stressor. I usually don't, for me and my coaching, I usually don't recommend anyone that is carnivore less than 6 months start fasting. It's more for those people that have been keto, been carnivore for a year or two. If they want to start implementing fasting, I think, intermittent fasting is great. It has its benefits. Anywhere, maybe up to the 24-hour mark is great. I think beyond that, it's questionable. Some will say it has its benefits. Others will say you don't get much benefit beyond the 24 hours. Some people, we end up and I'll support them through doing it. We have people that will do, extended fat fasting or water fasting. And like I said, I think it can be a great tool. I just come off of doing a fat fast. The only difference with my fat fasting that I did was I still had the caloric value. I was anywhere between like 150 grams of fat and 300 grams of fat. So I didn't have a huge deficit. I still had that in there, where some people, when you reference like a fat fast, it's like 500 calories and less. So I still had, the caloric value in there, but I honestly didn't really feel like I gained much from it. So I don't know that I'll incorporate it very often. But like I said, I am a carnivore and fasting coach through MeatRx, so I will support them having my history with the fasting. And it can be beneficial if they're ready, but those that have to force it and be like, oh, I said I was going to do 16, it's 12 hours and I'm hungry, I think then it's obviously not time for your body to do fasting. Right. You need to end up, and it needs to come more natural. So
it's really interesting because, the Walter Longo fasting mimicking, keto is a fasting mimetic. And the Walter Longo, when they do these Prolon packs, the food that you eat that day is basically almost no protein, except they're doing it more with carbs than fat. So, to do a fat fast, I had always questioned doing that, but it sounds like it would be very similar to that, like fasting mimicking, if people don't want to go, and do a water fast or that kind of thing. But just to cut the protein down for like a few days or something and see what happens. Like, you are always experimenting and seeing what happens. And I think that's so fantastic. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Becky. It was wonderful having you on the show and learning all about what you've been doing, and you're setting a great example. So really appreciate all that you share. And thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm so honored that you ended up and invited me to come on to speak with you. I appreciate it.
Awesome.